group of 4 tourists, Amy, Zach, Laura, and Tom, went on a hike in the dense forest to spend a weekend away from the hustle and bustle of the city. 2 days passed perfectly, fresh air, nature, and nightly conversations around the campfire. But on the 3rd day, everything changed. It was a crisp afternoon in the woods when they reached a little beach and enjoyed the sun for the first time. The weather suddenly deteriorated, the sky was covered with gray clouds and the forest began to look gloomy. The rain poured unexpectedly and the tourists realized that they had lost their route. The compass stopped working and their phones lost signal. "Are we going in circles?" Amy asked, looking around. "No way," Tom answered, trying to hide his anxiety. After an hour of wandering, they came across an old house that suddenly appeared in front of them among the trees. "This looks like salvation," Zach said, climbing up the porch. The house looked strange. It was clearly old, but surprisingly well preserved. The windows were intact, the door was not slanted, and the paint on the walls was fresh, as if someone had recently renovated it. End of chapter. "Maybe someone lives here?" Laura asked, looking around. "Who would live in a place like this?" Amy objected. Tom knocked on the door, but no one answered. "Think we'd better wait out the rain here," he suggested, pushing the door. The door opened easily, as if it had been waiting for them. The inside was clean, the furniture was neatly arranged, and there was a faint smell of damp in the air, as if the house had been empty for a long time. "Strange, but cozy," Zach noted, looking around the living room. "The main thing is a roof over your head," Laura nodded. They laid out their things, sat down at the table, and decided to wait for the weather to improve. But soon they noticed that something was wrong with the house. Still, night fell quickly, and the house was filled with an odd silence. The rain raged outside, and the wind howled in the empty hallways. The campers had spread out their sleeping bags on the living room floor, trying to stick together. "At least we're warm," Tom muttered, wrapping himself in a blanket. "Yeah, but this house is kind of weird," Laura noted, looking around. A little later, when everyone was starting to fall asleep, they heard a knock. Amy sat up, listening. The sound was coming from the hallway leading deeper into the house. It was a quiet, measured knock, like someone was walking slowly, touching the wall. "You hear that?" she whispered. Zach turned on a flashlight and illuminated the room, but saw nothing suspicious. "Probably the wind," he muttered, but his voice sounded uncertain. The knocking stopped, but after a few minutes, a new sound was heard, a soft creak, as if someone was slowly opening a window. "Someone's in the house," Tom said sharply, grabbing for the flashlight. They carefully walked around the rooms, but all the windows and doors were closed. However, each of them felt that something invisible was nearby. When they returned to the living room, Laura froze in front of the mirror that hung on the wall. "What is this?" she whispered, pointing to the reflection. In the mirror, in addition to their own reflections, there was another silhouette. It moved slowly, as if it were standing behind them, but when they turned around, they saw no one. "It's just a trick of the light," Zach muttered, but he himself stepped back from the mirror. The silhouette in the reflection began to move faster. It seemed to have a life of its own, mimicking their movements a little late, then faster than they could react. "It's looking at us," Amy breathed, grabbing Laura's hand. At that moment, there was a loud bang. One of the doors at the far end of the hallway swung open of its own accord. A draft blew out the candles, leaving them in semi-darkness. "We shouldn't have come in here," Tom said, his voice breaking. The footsteps were echoing throughout the house now. Heavy, sure, they were approaching. The mirror in the living room grew foggy, and then, from the depths of its reflection, black, empty eyes stared at them. The footsteps grew louder, coming from all directions. The house seemed to come alive. Its walls seemed to breathe, and the shadows in the corners began to move, as if stretching out toward the tourists. "We have to go, now!" Amy cried, grabbing her backpack. But when they ran to the door, it was gone. In place of the entrance was a smooth, seamless wall, as if the door had never existed. "It's a trap," Tom muttered, looking around. "This house, it won't let us go." The mirror in the living room began to vibrate. Cracks appeared on its surface, but their distorted reflections were still visible in them. The reflections did not repeat their movements now. They smiled, waved their hands, and then began to disappear one by one, as if dissolving into the glass. "It's taking us," Laura whispered, her voice shaking. "We shouldn't have come in here." She leaned back against the wall, talking. Zach began pounding on the walls in frustration, screaming for help, but his voice echoed through the empty hallways. Suddenly, the floor beneath his feet began to collapse, turning into a sticky, viscous mass. He tried to pull away, but his body was slowly being sucked in. "Help!" he cried out, but his voice cut off as he disappeared completely. The others stood there, speechless, unable to help. At that moment, Laura felt her hand stick to the back of the chair. She tried to pull it away, but her fingers felt like they were rooted to the wood. "No, no," she whispered, until her body began to merge with the chair, which began to look like it had been there for decades. "We became part of the house," Amy whispered, looking at the mirror. In the reflection, she saw her face slowly blurring into a shadowy silhouette. Her feet were rooted to the floor, her body becoming part of the room. The last thing she saw was Tom screaming, his arms stretching out, turning into long wooden bars, like an old door. "Hi!" The next day, the house looked as calm and empty as before. It stood among the trees, quiet, as if waiting for the next guests. Inside, everything was in place. Neat furniture, mirrors on the walls, and no sign that anyone had been here. Only in the reflection of the mirror could you see shadows for a moment, silhouettes frozen in anticipation of becoming part of a new story.